So let's summarise a little bit, and I'm going to do it in the following way. We now have an expression for planned aggregate expenditure, and we fully understand that that has both an exogenous and an endogenous component. We know that in general the economy's output, the economy's GDP, the economy's income, the economy's expenditure can be written as the expenditure of our four sectors: household consumption, firms. Now, in general, firms' expenditure can consist of either planned or unplanned investment, and we've had a good look at the circumstances where there will be some unplanned investment, government expenditure, and exports. I'd ask you to think back to our second lecture, where in the discussion of GDP, I also described for you how we can think of GDP in terms of aggregate income and how that aggregate income might be used. So this is not something we've talked about in the context of the Keynesian model, but I'm now going to bring that material in for a complete description of the economy's equilibrium and disequilibrium. Recall that aggregate income can be used for the purposes of consumption of domestic goods and services. It can also be used to purchase imports. It can also be used as saving, remembering that that saving is both saving by the private sector, that saving is private sector saving, so that's saving by households and business. And income can be used for taxation. What we have here is two different ways of representing the same thing, the economy's gross domestic product. So it must be the case if we subtract consumption from both of those expressions, that in general we have the following circumstance, where the economy's investment, both planned and unplanned, plus government expenditure, plus exports, must always be equal to the economy's imports, plus saving, plus taxation. Now let me work with that for a moment, and you'll see why this is important very shortly. I want to introduce first another piece of terminology for you. Imports, saving and taxation, when added together, are going to be known collectively as the economy's withdrawals. Withdrawals, you can think of this as the opposite of injections. Injections, remember, is where purchasing power is coming into the economy. Withdrawals, either through import, saving or taxation, think of that as a flow of purchasing power outside of the economy. What we've established is that at any point in time, the economy's withdrawals are going to have to correspond, simply through the logic of how we measure gross domestic product, to the economy's total investment plus government spending plus exports. Now, we're going to work on the assumption that withdrawals respond systematically to the economy's income. That the higher is the economy's income, the higher will be imports, the higher will be saving, and the higher will be taxation. If you think about it intuitively, that makes sense. The more income households have, for example, the more imports they're likely to purchase. The more income there is in the economy, the more saving is likely to be undertaken. And given the way we've written the tax system, you'll recall that taxes vary systematically with income as well. So withdrawals can be represented by a positively sloped line positively sloped because the higher is income, the higher will be withdrawals. Remember that at the same time, withdrawals must also correspond to the sum total of total investment, government spending and exports. Now you might be looking at that and being slightly puzzled, because didn't we say that planned investment, government spending and exports were exogenous and not related to income? Well, that's certainly true for those three components, but that's not true of unplanned investment, where unplanned investment can, through inventory changes, through unexpected inventory changes, vary according to production. If you're producing too much relative to planned aggregate expenditure, for example, then you're going to see unplanned inventories increase. So the withdrawal schedule, and it's probably easiest to think about it in terms of this right-hand side, the withdrawal schedule shows us the systematic relationship between imports, saving, taxation, collectively, and income. Now, why is that useful for us? It's useful for us if we go back and think carefully about the concept of equilibrium. Because equilibrium, at a very fundamental level, can be thought of as a situation where there are no surprises, where firms are not experiencing either an unexpected increase or an unexpected decrease in inventories. So that in equilibrium, I'll just write it like that, unplanned investment has to equal zero. There are no surprises, firms are not experiencing any unexpected changes to inventories. Which means in equilibrium, and only in equilibrium, it must be the case that planned investment plus government spending plus exports equals imports plus saving plus taxation, which are our withdrawals. This expression is true always, and that's just because of the way we have constructed our gross domestic product. This expression, however, is true only in equilibrium because it is only in equilibrium that there are no unplanned changes to investment. What I'm doing here is providing you with an alternate way of thinking about equilibrium that is perfectly consistent with what we've been looking at previously. So if we take that diagram and add to it planned injections, then this point here is another way of representing the economy's equilibrium. It is only at that point do we have withdrawals equal to planned injections, and withdrawals can only equal planned injections if there are no unplanned changes to inventories. What you're looking at there is an alternate representation of the economy's equilibrium. So now we can use both ways of thinking about equilibrium and provide a complete characterisation of the economy's equilibrium. Note that although the withdrawals equaling planned injections is an alternate way of thinking about equilibrium, you're really conveying the same information. It's a situation corresponding to planned aggregate expenditure being equal to output. There are no unplanned changes to investment. There are no reasons why firms should vary their levels of production. So let's build up this complete picture of equilibrium. We have now our withdrawals schedule, which has a positive slope because we think that savings, taxes and imports vary systematically with income. So there we have one way of representing the economy's equilibrium. That must, as a matter of logic, correspond to the more familiar way now of representing equilibrium, where planned aggregate expenditure cuts the 45-degree line. You're really looking at two different ways of saying the same thing. What we've done so far in this lecture is pretty significant. It's actually a lot of material that we've covered. What we've done is to provide a complete representation of what the economy's equilibrium will look like. We've shown there are various ways of doing this. One can think of equilibrium either as being in terms of withdrawals and planned injections being equal to each other, or one could think of equilibrium in terms of planned aggregate expenditure being equal to GDP. They're both really just different ways of saying the exact same thing. And we've also established that there are automatic forces in the economy that ensure the economy actually is at its equilibrium. And here the assumption that firms respond to any disequilibrium, that is, to any unplanned changes in their inventories, in a way that takes the economy back to equilibrium. So equilibrium is where we expect the economy to be. What I now want to do is address the question, how does this relate to the business cycle? Or more precisely, how does this relate to the creation of output gaps? Remembering that an output gap is a situation where the economy's actual GDP differs from the economy's potential GDP. So I want to start with the following. Let's suppose it just happens to be the case that the economy's equilibrium coincides with its potential GDP. So I want to start from a situation where there is no output gap. So you can see this illustrated in the diagram here. The economy's equilibrium corresponds to Y star. Y star is our notation for the economy's potential flow of GDP. The output gap here is 0. Now this is an equilibrium. The economy is at rest. There is no reason to expect that this situation would change. That is, there's no reason that this should change unless there is some exogenous change that is then imposed on the economy. Something happening external to the model that disturbs the economy and leads to changes. So what would be an example of an exogenous change? Well, an example that Keynes in the general theory emphasised a lot was the possibility of a revision to firms' planned investment. And Keynes thought this was pretty crucial to understanding the existence of output gaps. Remember that within this model we actually don't have an explanation for why this might occur. This is completely exogenous to the model. But Keynes himself thought that these changes to planned investment were a very significant feature of modern economies. And he attributed that to the fact that investment is such a forward-looking economic variable. We've talked about this before, how investment decisions made in the current period are actually made on the basis of what firms think might be the state of the economy in some future period. It's very hard to know what that might be. So Keynes thought that firms' investment decisions were not necessarily grounded in a very sort of scientific analysis of what the future might hold, but were very much subject to business people's expectations, feelings, gut feeling perhaps, about what the future might have in store, and that those sorts of calculations, those very subjective calculations, can be quite variable. So business people might wake up one morning, for example, and for whatever reason start to feel pessimistic about the future and think, well, maybe this isn't such a good time to be engaging in large-scale investment, and therefore they downsize their planned investment spending. But it doesn't have to be that. It could be any reason, anything going on there external to the model that has led to a downward revision in planned investment. What we want to do is see how we can analyse such an exogenous change in the context of this particular model. So to repeat, we're starting from a point of no output gap, where the equilibrium coincides with the economy's potential. We then introduce an exogenous change. In this case, a fall in planned investment. What happens? In the first instance, that will show up in planned injections. Remembering planned investment is one of the components of planned injections. The economy's planned injections line will therefore shift downwards. Now, it might take you a little while to get used to looking at diagrams like this and working out exactly what's going on. The way to think about it, and I think this is helpful, is to start labelling bits of the diagram so you can keep track of, the beginning point and what happens next. So our beginning point, and let's start with withdrawals and planned injections. Let's call our beginning point point A. After the exogenous fall in investment, the relevant point that relates to planned injections is no longer point A, but is point B. As far as planned injections are concerned, we have moved from point A to point B. As far as withdrawals are concerned, however, we are still at point A. Nothing's happened to withdrawals. Indeed, nothing has yet happened to the economy's income. Firms are still producing Y star. That hasn't changed yet. The only change at this point in our story is a fall in planned investment, a downward movement of the planned injections line. So the only difference is planned injections, the relevant point on planned injections is now point B. But straight away you can see we're now in a disequilibrium. We are now clearly in a disequilibrium because we have an imbalance between withdrawals and planned injections. Now, the fact that planned injections have fallen has implications for planned aggregate expenditure because, of course, planned injections is such an important component of planned aggregate expenditure. Planned aggregate expenditure also shifts down, and it will shift down in line with the fall in planned injections. The economy, if you like, now operates according to a new, lower planned aggregate expenditure line. This line here, which I've labelled PAE1. And again, let's label where we started and where we're going. Our original equilibrium, let's call it point A prime. That point, however, no longer corresponds to where we are in terms of planned aggregate expenditure because planned aggregate expenditure has fallen to B prime. Now, repeat, nothing has yet happened to production. There hasn't been time for that to adjust yet. So in terms of production, it's still Y star. In terms of planned aggregate expenditure, however, we are now at a point B star, which is below A star. So again, this is a situation of disequilibrium. We now have an imbalance between firms' production and the economy's planned aggregate expenditure. firms are overproducing relative to what the economy wishes to purchase. Well, we have a story about what happens in circumstances like this. The story is that disequilibrium will not persist. Firms will adjust their production. Firms are observing an unexpected increase in their inventories. Firms, therefore, cut back on production. So the economy's GDP starts to fall, the economy's income starts to fall. Two things happen in response. First of all, the economy's withdrawals move in line with the fall in income. So we get reductions in saving, taxation and imports, and that's shown by a movement down and along the withdrawal schedule. Households cut back on their consumption, and hence the economy's planned aggregate expenditure is further reduced, this time not as a downward shift in planned aggregate expenditure, but as a movement down and along planned aggregate expenditure. This is just the story we told before about how the economy transitions to a new equilibrium if it finds itself overproducing relative to planned aggregate expenditure. When do these movements stop? When we reach the new equilibrium. Once we reach the new equilibrium, let's call it point C in terms of withdrawals and the new lower level of planned injections. Let's call it point C prime in terms of the new lower planned aggregate expenditure and output. Once we reach those points, this process stops, the economy is at an equilibrium. And let me call that equilibrium YE, E for equilibrium, and let's call it 1. So this is actually pretty significant what you're observing here. What you're observing here is a very systematic piece of economic analysis that explains the emergence of a contractionary output gap. The economy is now producing a flow of GDP below its potential. It's producing a flow of GDP below its potential because there has been an exogenous change. In this instance, an exogenous fall in planned investment, pulling planned injections down, pulling planned aggregate expenditure down, creating disequilibrium, creating firms adjusting via lowering production, leading to a new equilibrium below potential. What you're looking at is a recession. Note the following. That new equilibrium is clearly endogenous. We've reached the new equilibrium because of what's happened within the model. Our model has explained why that new equilibrium has been reached. It's endogenous because it has responded, GDP has responded to the exogenous change in planned aggregate expenditure. Where does the contractionary output gap really come from? It's come about because the economy's potential GDP has not changed. That's still Y star. That's exogenous. It's determined by factors completely outside of this model, none of which have changed. It's the endogeneity of the economy's equilibrium and the exogeneity of the economy's potential output that is really at the heart of this Keynesian explanation for recessions. That's a really important and quite profound insight. And prior to Keynes, no one had really thought about it this way. And I think it's a very powerful statement about the actual nature of the business cycle and what this particular piece of analysis brings to our thinking about business cycles, the idea that there are endogenous forces in the economy that can bring about an equilibrium that's different from the exogenously given potential GDP. Let me just emphasise that this is just one example of how a recession can emerge, but it's a particularly important example. Have a look at this chart, which shows real gross private domestic investment for the United States economy. We've seen a few of these charts before. Remember that these shaded areas represent periods of recession, so contractionary output gaps. You don't have to look all that closely to see a very systematic pattern going on here. Prior to recessions, nearly always leading up to the recession, we get investment peaking and then dropping. This is exactly what our previous analysis showed, that these falls in investment can be responsible for contractionary output gaps. They're not the only reason we can get contractionary output gaps, and we'll discuss others as we go through this material. But Keynes himself was very keen to emphasise the important role played by planned investment, and certainly when you look at the economic data like this one, it's pretty hard to not conclude that changes to planned investment are certainly going to be a very important part of the reason why economies find themselves in recession. And the framework that we've been developing, this basic Keynesian model, now provides us with a very systematic way of understanding why that might be the case. All right, let's look at a different sort of exogenous change now, a completely different sort of exogenous change. Let's suppose for some reason we get an increase in the exogenous component of consumption. For whatever reason, it's exogenous, we don't know what the reason is, but for whatever reason, households have decided collectively that they're going to increase this part of their consumption expenditure. What might that reason be? Well, who knows, but it might be that households, for whatever reason, are feeling more optimistic about the future and decide that this might be a good time to increase their expenditure. For whatever reason, let's just assume that something like this has happened. What impact will this have on the economy? Again, I want to start with a situation where the economy is at its potential GDP. So our initial equilibrium can be illustrated either by point A, equality between withdrawals and planned injections, or point A prime, where the planned aggregate expenditure line cuts the 45-degree line. All right, for whatever reason, we now have this increase in exogenous consumption. What does that do to this model? Well, it's going to show up in the consumption function, fairly obviously. So the economy's consumption function shifts up. You can really see how this is an exogenous shift in consumption. At potential GDP, household consumption used to be there. Without income having changed, households now wish to increase their consumption. So it's an exogenous change in consumption. It's not been caused by a change in income, it's been caused by other factors. Now the interesting question is, how is this possible? How is it that households have increased their consumption if their income has not increased? What makes this possible is presumably that households have found the funds they need to finance that increase of investment from other sources. For example, they may have withdrawn money from their savings accounts, and that has implications for withdrawals. And let's suppose that's what's happened. It's probably the easiest way to tell this story. Households have withdrawn funds from their savings accounts in order to finance this exogenous increase in consumption. So saving has decreased for this exogenous reason. And if saving has decreased for this exogenous reason, then the economy's overall levels of withdrawals have also decreased. So the withdrawal schedule will shift downwards. The final part of the story is to remember that consumption is a component of planned aggregate expenditure. So if the consumption function has shifted up, so also has planned aggregate expenditure. So if we go back to this withdrawal schedule, the relevant point on the withdrawal schedule is now point B. Straight away you can see we're no longer in equilibrium. The economy's withdrawals are now below the economy's planned injections. In terms of planned aggregate expenditure, we're now at B prime. We have more planned aggregate expenditure, even though the economy's GDP is unchanged, it's still at Y star. Again, you're now looking clearly at a disequilibrium. This is a disequilibrium where there has been an unexpected increase in planned aggregate expenditure. Firms are going to be finding that their inventories are unexpectedly declining. Firms will respond by boosting production, so the economy's GDP will increase. Now, what we're talking about here is an increase of GDP above potential GDP, but remember that's possible, at least in the short run, if firms hire workers much more overtime, for example, or if firms run their factories 24 hours a day instead of 12 hours a day, you can push GDP above potential. Incomes in the economy will be increasing. There's more GDP, there's more income. What does an increase in income do? It stimulates more withdrawals, so we start to see that showing up as a movement up and along the withdrawal schedule. It stimulates more consumption. It leads to more planned aggregate expenditure. We've told this story before. It leads to a new equilibrium. And let's call this new equilibrium YE1, and what we have here is the creation of an expansionary output gap. So again, planned aggregate expenditure has been the key. Again, we have our exogenous potential GDP unchanged, but we have our actual equilibrium GDP being endogenously determined within the model, in this case increasing as a result of an exogenous change, a change in this example in household consumption behaviour. So what we have here is a pretty complete explanation of the existence of business cycles, complete in the sense that we now understand through this framework the importance of planned aggregate expenditure in generating the business cycle. That should planned aggregate expenditure decrease, that can cause the economy's equilibrium GDP to fall and lead to a contractionary output gap. Should planned aggregate expenditure increase, you might end up in the opposite situation with the creation of an expansionary output gap. So let me just summarise this process for you. I think the easiest way to always use this framework is to identify your initial equilibrium. And our initial equilibrium will be, my apologies, there's a typo there. Where planned aggregate expenditure equals GDP or planned injections equals withdrawals. That may or may not correspond to potential GDP. Often in these analyses, just from an analytical point of view, it's convenient to assume you start with potential GDP, but it's not necessarily the case. And that's an equilibrium, so if nothing changes, that is where the economy itself will stay. What's interesting in this framework is to introduce an exogenous change. There can be various types of exogenous changes. It might be an exogenous change to one of the components of planned injections, either planned investment, exports or government spending. We focused in this lecture on planned investment, but the same sort of analysis holds for the other two components of planned injections as well. As an exercise, you might like to convince yourself of that. Other things can change though. There could be changes in exogenous consumption as we've analysed. Imports might have an exogenous component, that could change. Taxes might have an exogenous component, that could change as well. All of those changes are likely to affect household consumption. So we have a framework that starts in equilibrium, we then introduce an exogenous change and we see what happens next. What happens next is there'll be a shift in planned aggregate expenditure, that is in the planned aggregate expenditure schedule itself. There'll be a situation of disequilibrium created. The important point about disequilibrium is that it's associated with unintended changes in inventories. Following on from that is the very important assumption in this framework that firms, when they observe those unintended changes in inventories, take that as a signal that they need to adjust production. They need to adjust production because they don't want to have these unintended change in inventories. It's a signal that they've gotten their production wrong. The change in production, of course, is equivalent to a change in the economy's GDP. Remember that that's a change in income. Production and income are two different words for the same thing at the level of the macroeconomy. That's going to lead to what is sometimes called induced, or if you like, endogenous changes to consumption and withdrawals, and that's part of the transition process to a new equilibrium. And then we move to a new equilibrium. Where planned aggregate expenditure is once again equal to GDP, planned injections once again equal to withdrawals. And it may or may not correspond to potential GDP. Certainly if we started at potential GDP and there is an exogenous change, where you end up is not going to be equivalent to potential GDP. And so we get the creation of output gaps. So it's a very rich but very systematic story about why it is that we see periods where economies have either contractionary or expansionary output gaps. It's a framework that very clearly identifies for us what we mean by macroeconomic equilibrium, and even more clearly identifies for us the circumstances in which that equilibrium might change, and moreover enables us to understand why it is that the economy in the short run might find itself with a situation where its actual GDP can be different from its potential GDP. Now, previous lecture we covered an enormous amount of ground, building up an analytical framework that enables us to understand the role that exogenous changes, in particular exogenous changes that impact on planned aggregate expenditure, the role that those changes have in leading to the creation of output gaps. It's a very important piece of analysis that's had incredible influence both on the way that macroeconomists view the economy and also on the way that governments view their role in managing the macroeconomy. And that's going to be a key theme of this particular lecture. So I'll take you back for a moment to our analysis of the effects of an exogenous fall in planned investment. You recall that we started with the economy at its potential GDP. We had, for whatever reason, a fall in planned investment. That set up, in the first instance, a situation of disequilibrium, causing firms to adjust downwards their production plans. That has implications for income in the economy, which leads to changes to withdrawals and consumption. In doing so, we have a transition to a new lower equilibrium level of GDP and the creation of a contractionary output gap. You may have noticed something when we went through this analysis. It's something, when you first see it, I think, is actually quite extraordinary. Have a look at the diagram. The process that I've just described was all because of a downward shift in planned injections. And the magnitude of that downward shift, the magnitude of the fall in planned injections, is of course measured by the distance between those two planned injections lines. Through the mechanism that I've outlined, we end up with a contractionary output gap, with a level of equilibrium GDP below that of potential. Have a look at the size of that output gap, or in other words, have a look at the change in equilibrium GDP. It's pretty big. It's actually much larger than the exogenous change in planned injections. What we have here is a situation, this will be true in general, where we have a change in planned injections leads to a change in GDP in the economy, where that change in GDP is actually larger than the change in planned injections that began the whole process. This is something which macroeconomists call the multiplier. It's actually a very evocative piece of terminology. It's as if the change in planned injections has had a multiplied effect on GDP. It has an effect on GDP much larger than the initial exogenous change in planned injections. That's actually a really significant point. The existence of the multiplier tells us that you don't necessarily need a very large change in planned injections for there to be a relatively large change in equilibrium GDP. In other words, small exogenous changes are perhaps capable of leading to large output gaps. You don't need much of a change in planned injections, according to this multiplier process, in order for there to be a relatively large change in GDP. So this concept of the multiplier summarises the effects of a change in exogenous expenditure on equilibrium output. I'll show you in a moment that as a matter of logic, it's really just an application of the circular flow of income. But it's a very important concept. It tells us, for example, that you might have a change in planned injections equal to, I don't know, pick a number, 50. The implication might be a change in the economy's equilibrium, GDP of 150. If that was true, we would say that the value of the multiplier in this instance equals 3. So sometimes it's useful or convenient to think of the multiplier just as a number which tells us by how much more the eventual change in GDP is relative to the initial exogenous change that started the whole process off. So let me take you through a slightly different way of showing the multiplier and give you a very simple example of why it is we would expect to see the multiplier in action. I'm going to take a smaller scale economy to what we've been using just to make the point. So I'm going to have a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8. There's nothing magic about that number, could have chosen any number, but I do need a number, so let's just choose 0.8. I'll assume there's no endogenous taxes, so the tax rate is 0. And I'll also assume a closed economy, so there's no exports or imports. Don't need to make any of those assumptions. You could do this with taxes, you could do this with an open economy, which you have exports and imports. It just makes the analysis much, much more messy. Now, the multiplier was a key concept in the general theory. And many people associate this concept of the multiplier with Keynes. And most economists, indeed, are introduced to this concept through reading the general theory or learning about the basic Keynesian model. The concept of the multiplier, however, was not developed by Keynes. In fact, the first recorded mention of what we would recognise as the multiplier was made by this scholar here, an economist called Giblin, who was a professor of economics at my university, the University of Melbourne. So I kind of take great delight in telling this story, who in a public lecture that he gave at the university in the early 1930s first outlined the concept of the multiplier. So whilst most people associate the multiplier with the general theory and Keynesian economics, it actually has a longer pedigree than that, going back to my institution, which is something I like to tell people for very obvious reasons. Anyway, let's develop this example of the multiplier. So we've got this very simple economy. We don't have to worry about the government so much. There's no taxes. We don't have to worry about exports and imports. So let's think of this as being a very simple economy in which we have essentially households and firms. We'll assume it's initially in equilibrium, as we've defined, but then there is an exogenous change. And the exogenous change is a $100 decrease in planned investment. Now, you've got to remember that when a firm undertakes a piece of investment expenditure, it's buying perhaps some capital equipment. It's actually purchasing production maybe of other firms. There will be firms out there that are in the business of producing capital equipment. So when firms decide to decrease their planned investment, this has implications for other firms' production in the economy. If there's $100 less planned investment expenditure, then that's going to imply, in the first instance, a reduction in production of $100. There'll be $100 less capital equipment produced. What does that mean? Well, from the circular flow of income idea, from this idea that production and income are two different ways of saying the same thing, this economy now has $100 less income as a result of the cutback in production. What does that really mean? It means households now have a reduction in their income of $100. Now, if that was the end of the story, there wouldn't actually be a multiplier. If that was the end of the story, what we have here is a $100 decrease in planned investment has led to a $100 decrease in production, $100 decrease in income, in other words, a $100 decrease in GDP. But here's where the multiplier comes in. It's not the end of the story, because how do households respond to their income being reduced by $100? They cut back on their consumption. They don't cut their consumption by the full $100, however, and this is where the marginal propensity to consume comes in, because it works in both directions. When I introduced the concept, I talked about an increase in income, what that means for consumption expenditure. Works the other way as well. If households find that their income has been reduced, they cut back on their consumption, but not by the whole amount of the reduction in income. They might dip into some saving, for example, to make sure that their consumption doesn't have to fall by the full amount of the income that falls. With a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, when households experience a $100 fall in their income, they cut back on their consumption by $80. But what does that mean? It means for firms, they're now going to cut back on their production by $80. That means in this economy there is $80 less income, which means households now face an income cut of $80. This is like an additional round. How do households respond to that $80 reduction in their income? They cut back on their consumption. With a marginal propensity to consume of 0.8, they cut back their consumption by $64, and this just keeps going on and on and on. Firms cut their production by $64, income falls by $64, and so on until eventually the whole thing will run out of steam. The main point, however, is that our initial $100 decrease in planned investment is clearly going to have a much larger overall effect on GDP than $100. In this case, there's going to be an additional $80 less consumption, followed by an additional $64 less consumption, followed by even more cutbacks in consumption as this cycle plays itself out. So you can see, I think, from this very simple example, that the initial exogenous change, in this case the $100 fall in planned investment, is just the beginning of a long and complicated chain of events that leads to an overall change in GDP, which as a matter of logic will be much larger. Works in the other direction. Suppose we had a $100 exogenous increase in consumption. Of itself, that will bring forward $100 extra production, leading to an additional $100 worth of income. That flows back to households who increase their consumption by $80. Remember, marginal propensity to consume equals 0.8, $80 of production, $80 of income, and so on. So the existence of the multiplier seems like not too surprising a result once we think of the way exogenous changes in the economy flow through in the first instance to changes in production, what that means for income, how households respond to that income change, and how this process is repeated over multiple rounds, each round getting just that little bit smaller, and it gets that little bit smaller because when households have an income change, they adjust their consumption by some proportion of that income change. So let's just think logically about the multiplier and about some of the things that might be relevant in this context. First of all, the size of the multiplier itself, that can change. It'll be larger if, for example, the marginal propensity to consume is larger. In other words, if out of each income change, households adjust their consumption by a larger amount, then as a matter of logic, that must mean that the multiplier effect itself will be larger. Should the tax rate be smaller, if we're now dealing with a world where the government does levy taxes, a smaller tax rate means each time income adjusts, households' disposable income is affected more than if the tax rate was larger. So that must have implications for the multiplier. Or if what's called the marginal propensity to import is smaller. So if out of any change in income, households devote a relatively smaller proportion of that change to purchasing imports, then that must mean the multiplier will be larger as well. What this means is that across different economies, perhaps even across different time periods in the same economy, the value of the multiplier might be larger or smaller, depending on some of these key structural features of the economy. The other thing about this very simple multiplier analysis is it basically treats a whole lot of different things in the economy as pretty much having the same effect on the economy. In particular, those three components of planned injections, investment, exports and government spending, The multiplier, as I'm presenting it here, assumes that they all have pretty much the same effect upon the ultimate flow of equilibrium GDP. There's a symmetry between investment, exports and government expenditure. Later in this lecture I'm going to talk a lot about government expenditure and why that might be a little bit different. But let's just explore this symmetry between those three components of planned injections. I'm going to do it using just a little bit of algebra because this is probably the quickest way to show it. The algebra is not difficult, but if this is something you feel uncomfortable with, as long as you are aware of the intuition, I think that's fine. So we've noted before in this Keynesian model the notion of equilibrium as being equivalence between output and planned aggregate expenditure. So we've seen that. We've made extensive use of that concept. If we take our complete model of household consumption and substitute that into this expression, then we can arrive at this sort of expanded view of the equilibrium condition. I've not said anything different here. All I've done is to write out what the consumption function looks like in its complete form. Note that I'm dealing only with equilibrium here, so that's why I've got the little superscript E above or next to Y every time you see that. Now I've got equilibrium GDP on both the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the equation. So with some elementary algebra, I can just isolate GDP on the left-hand side, and I get this expression here, which really just reminds us that the economy's equilibrium is at a fundamental level determined by all of these exogenous aspects of the economy, as well as by the marginal propensity to consume and the tax rate. So we've explored that before, but this is just an algebraic reminder of that fact. Why do I want to write the economy's equilibrium in this way? Because I can now take each of these variables in turn and ask the question, should either one of those variables change, what will be the ultimate change on equilibrium GDP? And I've just written this out for you. This may or may not be terribly clear, but if you work your way through it, you should be able to see what's going on here. Here, the question I'm asking here is, suppose the only aspect of the economy to change was exogenous consumption. What are the implications for the change in equilibrium GDP? And given this equation star here, you can see that that's going to be whatever the change in consumption is with this term, 1 divided by 1 minus C, bracket 1 minus T out the front. So that just gives us a little formula for calculating what the change will be for equilibrium GDP when consumption changes. And you can see that the nature of the formula is pretty much the same no matter whether it's a change in exogenous consumption or planned investment or government spending or exports. What this tells us is that a $1 change in either of those components will have exactly the same implication for equilibrium GDP as a $1 change in any other of those components. So as far as equilibrium GDP is concerned, it doesn't really matter much if it's planned investment that's changing by $1, or government spending, or exports, or exogenous consumption. What happens to equilibrium GDP is exactly the same. The only exception is taxes, which is a bit complicated because it has this marginal propensity to consume out the front. So we'll just put that to one side, but certainly for the other exogenous components in the economy, as far as the multiplier process is concerned, it doesn't really matter which one of those changes. Later in this lecture, I do have a want to focus on government, because in the real world things are probably a little bit more complicated than this might suggest, but we'll certainly come back to that. What we've now done is to establish a very powerful analytical framework for analysing the effect that exogenous changes can have on the economy's equilibrium flow of GDP. We've seen how output gaps can emerge, how a fall in exogenous planned aggregate expenditure, for example, can lead to a contractionary output gap. We've even seen how expansionary output gaps might emerge. What I want to focus on for the rest of this lecture is on the government response to all of this. Prior to the publication of the general theory, prior to this way of thinking about the macroeconomy, governments weren't really, it's a bit of a generalisation, but governments weren't really, didn't really see themselves as managers of the macroeconomy in the way that governments now do. One of the significant changes in public policy that the publication of the general theory led to was the taking on by governments all over the world, the taking of the responsibility for managing the macroeconomy, in the first instance to try to avoid events like the Great Depression from ever happening again, but subsequently the phrase often used is fine-tuning the economy to keep the economy as close as possible to its potential GDP. And this framework, this basic Keynesian framework, as simple as it is, has had an enormous influence on the way governments view themselves as managers of the macroeconomy. In particular, the response of so many governments to the events of the global financial crisis can be understood, I think, as very much an application of the sorts of principles that we've been talking about in these lectures. The big fear when the global financial crisis hit was that this would lead to a collapse in planned aggregate expenditure. And what we saw in economies the world over is governments trying very hard to implement measures that would prevent that fall in planned aggregate expenditure from occurring. In other words, trying very hard to prevent equilibrium GDP falling and the creation of large output gaps. And a variety of different techniques were implemented, and we'll start talking about some of those from this lecture going forwards. But what I want you to see is how the analytical framework that we've been developing in some sense provided an intellectual basis for government's response to the global financial crisis. But we'll also talk about some of the difficulties that then created. So let me explain. So here is our contractionary output gap. We know how the economy can get itself into this situation. The first example we looked at was an exogenous fall in planned investment, leading to the attainment of an equilibrium flow of GDP below potential. And we now understand the role that the multiplier plays in this, so that you don't actually need that large change in planned aggregate expenditure or that large a fall in planned injections for something like this to happen. So governments looking at this sort of analysis would reasonably ask, well, is there anything we can do to prevent this from happening? Or if we find ourselves in this situation, how can we get back to potential GDP? And the answer is kind of pretty obvious from the viewpoint of this basic Keynesian model. Think about yourself as a member of the government and think about what can you do as a member of the government to directly impact the economy's equilibrium GDP. One of the things you control is government expenditure. And we've seen how the algebra of the basic Keynesian model provides a direct link between changes in government expenditure and changes in equilibrium GDP. It's the link that's illustrated for you in this formula here. Well, think what that formula is also telling you. Suppose you've got a contractionary output gap, let's call it 100. Well, by how much should you increase government expenditure to remove that contractionary output gap? Now, it's obvious from the logic of the model that increasing government expenditure is a potential means of eliminating the contractionary output gap, because what you would be doing is feeding directly into planned injections and reversing the fall in planned injections that we've seen as a result of that fall in planned investment. So you're a member of the government, you're facing a contractionary output gap, it's been brought about by a fall in one of the components of planned injections, planned investment. How can you offset this? How can you reverse the process? Well, focus on government expenditure, which is the component of planned injections that you directly control. So you're trying to eliminate a contractionary output gap of 100. How much extra government spending do you need? Well, the multiplier tells us you don't need to increase government expenditure by the full 100. In fact, if we rearrange that formula, it actually provides you with a little bit of guidance. It tells you how much government spending, it tells you by how much you might need to change government expenditure. For example, suppose the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75 and the tax rate is 5%, 0.05. And remember, what you're trying to do is you want to bring about a change in equilibrium GDP of 100. Well, the formula now tells you what you need to do. You need only increase your government expenditure by 28.75. The multiplier will take that change and convert it into a change in equilibrium income that will eliminate the contractionary output gap. In terms of our diagram, suppose the economy was in equilibrium here or here, and we have the contractionary output gap. How can you solve the problem? Boost government spending. By how much? 28.75. That will shift injections up. That will shift planned aggregate expenditure up. That will move the economy to a new equilibrium, an equilibrium that corresponds to potential GDP, an equilibrium where you have removed the contractionary output gap. So the big lesson that a great many policymakers took from this basic Keynesian model was that through clever management of planned aggregate expenditure, and in particular, given that governments have direct control over government expenditure, through managing their government expenditure, but in a proactive way, it might be possible to reverse contractionary output gaps, or even better, if you fear that a contractionary output gap might be emerging, as many governments did when the global financial crisis hit, then an immediate boost to government expenditure might avoid the contractionary output gap altogether. If the problem is planned investment is falling, get in there quickly, increase government spending to offset that fall in planned investment, and maybe you'll avoid the contractionary output gap. This is exactly what governments all over the world did in the wake of the global financial crisis. And what we saw in country after country was a big increase in the size of the budget deficit, brought about to some extent, quite a large extent, by deliberate policies taken to increase government expenditure precisely for the reasons that I've indicated. You can see that pretty clearly in these data, which contrast the budget deficit as proportion of GDP for a variety of countries between 2000 and the sort of the height of concern about the global financial crisis around about 2009. You can see, Greece, Ireland, United Kingdom, United States, Spain, lots and lots of places where we ended up with, incredibly high budget deficits. Not done as an accident, not done because governments weren't trying to achieve outcomes, but actually done quite deliberately as an attempt to maintain the flow of planned aggregate expenditure to try to avoid the contractionary output gap that everybody feared was opening up as a result of the seriousness of the global financial crisis. In economics, there has been a huge debate raging about whether this policy response to the global financial crisis was the appropriate one. Not just economists have been debating this, politicians have been debating this, the general public, I think, has been debating the extent to which the measures that governments took as a response to the global financial crisis, whether these were in fact the correct ones. You can see that these decisions did have an intellectual basis in this basic Keynesian model, but the basic Keynesian model is just that, a model. The real world, we've talked about this before, is much more complex and much more messier. And it's not necessarily the case just because in a nice neat 45-degree diagram that things seem to work out so well. It's not always the case that translates exactly into real-world policy success. Now let me stress, the debate on this is far from resolved. There are many economists who think this was the exact right policy response. There are many others who are perhaps less convinced by that. So what I want to do here is just draw your attention to some of the issues that are relevant in this debate. I mentioned before that the basic Keynesian model sort of treats the various components of planned injections as symmetrical in terms of their impact upon gross domestic product. It didn't really matter much which component of planned injections changed. The analysis was the same for each and every one of them. Now that actually misses out at least one important part of the real world, and that is that government expenditure has to be financed. It has to be financed, it has to be paid for in some way. And we didn't consider that in our discussion of the effects of an increase in government spending as a means of eliminating contractionary output gap. But this is actually something that governments have to worry about, for fairly obvious reasons, quite seriously. Governments do have to finance their expenditure. Broadly speaking, there are two alternative means of doing that. One is through the raising of taxation, or governments can borrow the money. Now, borrowing the money by the governments means the government doing what is called issuing government bonds or securities. We'll talk more about these in a later lecture, but essentially selling pieces of paper in return for the provision of financing from the private sector. So when governments are considering increasing their expenditure, they may have, and often do, I would like to think, the very best intentions in the world, but they do have to confront the reality that that increase in expenditure has to be financed, and this can be done either through raising the money from taxes or from borrowing that money. There are different types of government spending we also need to keep track of in this discussion. There's government expenditure, which is the national accounts variable, G, that we have essentially been talking about. But there are other forms of government spending as well that if we're talking about financing the government's budget, which is really what we are talking about here, they have to keep, or they have to be very aware of. As well as expenditure, that is expenditure on final goods and services, governments also embark on what are called transfer payments. These are done through the welfare system. Unemployment benefits would be an example of a transfer payment, or an old age pension, or anything like that. But these represent resources that are being transferred by the government and for which financing might be required. I'm going to use the letter Q as my notation for transfer payments. There's a third type of government spending, the interest on the public debt. This relates to the liabilities that governments have accumulated from past borrowing. So I'm going to use the letter B to represent what's known as the stock of public debt. So this is the accumulated debt that the government sector has built up over the years through past borrowing from the private sector. I'm going to put a little T-1 there to indicate that what's relevant at any given point in time is the stock of government debt that has been accumulated up to the beginning of that point in time. So if we take T as our index of a particular point in time, the interest that the government is responsible for in period T is the interest on the stock of debt that it has accumulated up to the end of the immediate past period, period T-1. And I'm going to write little r as the interest rate that is levied on that stock of debt. So the total resources the government has to find to pay its interest bill in any particular time period relates to the stock of debt that the government has carried over from the immediate past period multiplied by the interest rate that is levied on that debt. So we have three different types of government spending, and we have two different ways of financing that spending, either through taxation or borrowing. Let's bring all that information together in an important concept known as the government budget constraint. The government budget constraint simply recognises that the same as households, there is a sense in which governments have to operate within their means. So let me take you through this government budget constraint. Here we have government expenditure, final expenditure on goods and services as recorded in the national accounts. Governments also need to find resources for transfer payments, the social welfare system. The government also needs to find resources to meet its interest obligations, to pay its interest bill. Where does the government find the resources to finance those three spending needs? From taxation, or in any period it can issue some new debt. So there might be a difference between the stock of debt at the end of the period and the stock of debt at the beginning of the period. Or to put it more simply, the government might choose to engage in some further borrowing. If we rearrange that equation, we get the following, where on the left-hand side we have a measure of the government's overall budget position, in terms of its spending commitments relative to the income it gets from taxation. And what this tells us is that should the government's spending commitments exceed its taxation, then it really has no other choice but to issue new debt. So that budget deficits, situations where the three spending components are higher than taxation, then the government is going to have to finance that through further borrowing. This is exactly what many governments did to finance their spending initiatives during the global financial crisis. And as a consequence, for many countries, we saw very rapid increases in the ratio of the government's stock of debt, the public debt, to their gross domestic product. There's a lot of discussion about this, both in the context of European countries and the United States as well. You can see some of these debt ratios are quite extraordinary. Japan, well over 200%, Greece, the United States, the United Kingdom, have all accumulated very large stocks of public debt relative to GDP. So that's one of the first things I want to say about the use of government expenditure as a means to eliminate a contractionary output gap. It may work, and the logic of the basic Keynesian model suggests that that is a very real possibility, but it implies a willingness to take on an increased amount of debt. And whether the sorts of levels of debt we're looking at in this chart, 150, 200%, whether those are what are known as sustainable levels of debt, that is, whether there is a real likelihood that sufficient income will be earned in the future to actually pay that debt off, or that is a matter of a great deal of public debate and controversy at the moment. Don't want to get into that controversy in this lecture. What I do want to point out to you, however, is the decision to use government expenditure as a means of fighting a recession carries with it, perhaps, implications for the level of public debt that will then be carried forward into the future. There's another aspect to this discussion that I want to bring your attention to, and this is the concept of the multiplier itself. Within the macroeconomics research literature, there's a great deal of work now being undertaken, and ever since the global financial crisis, to actually try to quantify the size of the government expenditure multiplier. Just how likely is it that using government expenditure will actually lead to the multiplied increases in equilibrium GDP that our simple basic Keynesian analysis suggests that we could reasonably expect? And like so much in the research literature, the picture that emerges is a great deal more complicated than what you might think from the basic model that we've been working with. I certainly want you to be aware of this debate. The debate centres around whether we can reasonably expect the size of the government expenditure multiplier to necessarily be a large number. And it's not obvious that this is necessarily the case. For example, suppose that increases in government expenditure put upward pressure on interest rates. Now, why that might be the case goes back to this government budget constraint, the fact that governments are often forced to borrow in order to finance that expenditure. If the government is out there in financial markets borrowing and borrowing up big, creates a significant increase in the demand for those borrowed funds. Borrowed funds, like everything else, represent a scarce resource. If there's a large increase in demand for those funds, stands to reason that's going to push up their price. And the price of borrowed funds is the interest rate. So governments might, through the financing of their increased expenditure, push up interest rates in the economy. Why might that affect the size of the multiplier? Interest rates are one of those exogenous factors that influence planned investment expenditure. We've talked about this briefly before. The availability and the cost of financing influences planned investment. If increased government borrowing, being used to finance increased government expenditure, leads to high interest rates, then investment might be, and this is the term that's often used in this debate, crowded out. You might actually be discouraging firms from investing because the act of government borrowing is pushing up interest rates. To the extent that this is happening, that you're getting this offsetting decrease in planned investment, then the multiplier associated with the increased government expenditure might actually be a bit smaller than what we first might have thought. A second important part of this debate, a second concern that many economists have about whether the government expenditure multiplier is actually going necessarily to be that high, relates to, again, the government budget constraint. Suppose people in the economy, this could be both households and firms, see the increases in government debt that are being incurred as a result of the higher expenditure. We know that that is going to have to be paid for at some point in the future. We may therefore come to the conclusion, pretty logical conclusion in fact, that at some point in the future governments are going to have to raise taxes in order to provide the resources that are needed in order to meet the interest payments on that debt, in order to pay off that debt, in other words. It follows directly from the government budget constraint. Well, if households and firms are thinking this way and associating the higher government expenditure with higher debt and with higher taxes in the future, it makes sense to start planning for that now. And if you're a household, for example, you might put aside extra saving now so that you have the resources at hand when taxes increase in the future. The firms might do something similar. And so we might get the possibility of future tax increases being factored into current decision making. Let's focus on households. If households are increasing their saving now in anticipation of higher taxes in the future, well, that's going to mean they're going to cut back on their consumption now. Again, that's going to offset the increase in government expenditure. It's going to mean that the multiplier effect is smaller than what we might think. So there are at least two reasons at this analytical level to start wondering about whether the multiplier associated with government expenditure is necessarily as large as it might appear from our basic Keynesian analysis. Now, trying to establish in any sort of definitive sense how large the multiplier is actually an extraordinarily difficult task for economic researchers. It's really difficult because the data we have are imperfect, we don't have that many observations to go on, the statistical techniques we have are very sensitive to changes in underlying assumptions. There are a whole host of reasons that mean our ability to just objectively come up with a number for the government expenditure multiplier, it's just a very difficult research task. This hasn't stopped economists from trying, and there is a huge literature now emerging with some of the best and brightest minds in macroeconomics exactly trying to quantify the multiplier to see whether what governments did in the global financial crisis actually had an impact. I'm not going to summarise that literature for you because it is quite huge and new results are emerging every day. I just want to give you a flavour of that literature by outlining the conclusions from one of the best known papers in this tradition, a paper by Olivia Blanchard and Roberto Perotti in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which I'm sure you can find in a library if you wish to read the entire paper, that looked exactly at this question. What does the empirical evidence suggest would be a reasonable number for the government expenditure multiplier? If you do look at that paper, and it's not a required part of this course, it's a complex piece of advanced macroeconomic research, you'll very quickly come to appreciate some of the practical difficulties in answering this question. But I do want to make you aware of their conclusions. From the several specifications we have estimated and different exercises we have performed, and they do go through a number of different approaches to try to get a definitive answer to this question, we reach the following conclusions. First conclusion seems to make sense. When government spending increases, output increases. When taxes increase, output falls. It's exactly what you would expect from the basic Keynesian model. So that's fine, that's reassuring in some sense. But here's the sting in the tail. In most cases, the multipliers are small, often close to 1. There is no multiplier, in other words. You increase government spending by $100, you get increased GDP by $100, you're not getting that multiplied effect. In other words, to eliminate the contractionary output gap of the sorts of sizes we saw during the global financial crisis is going to require a one-for-one increase in government expenditure, and that's huge. They attribute it to the crowding out effect. There are probably other things going on as well, but this is certainly a conclusion from the research literature that gives one, I guess, pause to think about and perhaps provides some sort of explanation for why the increases in government expenditure that so many governments put in place as a response to the global financial crisis had to be so massive and to lead to such an accumulation of public debt. One final qualification, and this is actually not mentioned all that often in the literature, so this is something I like to talk about. It goes back to the idea that what we are talking about are flows, and government expenditure is indeed a flow. So it's kind of foolish to think about a one-off increase in government expenditure as being the solution to a contractionary output gap. Because if you increase government expenditure, let's say for one period, and then not keep that increase going in subsequent periods, then it's as if you hadn't done it at all. It's a flow. It exists for a finite period of time. Take this particular example that we have here. So we've got this contractionary output gap, and we've increased government expenditure to push planned injections up, and that's fine. Let's just ignore this debate about the size of the multiplier. Let's just suppose that this has happened. And let's suppose we've done this over a particular period of time. Let's say we've done this in the year 2009. But the government budget constraint is there. We can't keep doing this forever. And so at some point, governments have to perhaps reverse this and say, okay, we can't keep financing this increase in government expenditure forever. Let's take notice of our government budget constraint, and let's just say, okay, we've tried, we've increased our government expenditure, we've eliminated the contractionary output gap, we can now cut back on government expenditure. Something like this is happening in Europe through the austerity measures, where governments in Western Europe are responding to their high levels of public debt by cutting back now on their government expenditure. But suppose the underlying sources of weakness that got you into the contractionary output gap are still there. Then all that is going to happen as a result of introducing the austerity measures, of reversing the previous increases in government expenditure, is you're going to go back to the contractionary output gap. So when we speak of using government expenditure as a mechanism or as an instrument to try to eliminate a contractionary output gap, even within the logic of the basic Keynesian model, that's true, but it's a flow. It's a flow, so it's only true over a certain period of time. If that increase in government expenditure is reversed and the underlying reasons for the contractionary gap are still there, you may end up going back into the contractionary gap and you perhaps haven't solved the problem at all. In the final part of this lecture, I want to continue on this theme of governments managing the macroeconomy and using this basic Keynesian model as a way of thinking about how that might happen. We've looked at fiscal policy, and we've seen how in the logic of the model it's possible, for example, that changes in government expenditure might be a means of managing the macroeconomy, of correcting a contractionary output gap, for example. Then we also discussed some of the difficulties with doing that. There is another type of macroeconomic policy that is used quite extensively, in fact used more often than fiscal policy in this regard, and that's monetary policy. We're going to talk lots more about monetary policy in later lectures, but I just want to show you how monetary policy fits into this basic Keynesian framework and give you a bit of an insight as to why during the global financial crisis, for example, it wasn't just fiscal policy or government spending that was used. Monetary policy was also an important component of government's response to the crisis. So let's take as our starting point an economy that's in a contractionary output gap. And we now understand that an economy in this sort of equilibrium, there is perhaps a role for government to play in trying to encourage or to stimulate or to directly bring about an increase in planned aggregate expenditure so that we can move to a situation where the economy's equilibrium corresponds to potential GDP. So that's the aim of government management of the macroeconomy, at least in this context. Now, how can monetary policy assist this process? What is monetary policy, first of all? It's actually a bit difficult to pin down an exact definition of monetary policy because different countries implement different types of monetary policy depending on their financial systems. But broadly speaking, when we speak of monetary policy, we're talking about the central bank intervening in the economy, in particular intervening in financial markets in particular ways that influence either the rate of interest that exists in the economy or perhaps the availability of credit. And sometimes those two things are used simultaneously. Sometimes the emphasis is on one, sometimes the emphasis is on the other. I'm going to focus mostly on the influencing of rates of interest. I think that's a little easier to explain. It shouldn't be too hard to go from what I'm saying towards situations such as in the United States, where they implement now what is known as quantitative easing, which is very much direct action to try to influence the availability of credit. But I'm going to focus on the more general case and the policies that are more widely used, and that is central bank interventions to influence rates of interest. I'm not going to talk so much about how central banks can influence rates of interest. We'll actually touch a bit on that in a later lecture. For the purposes of this lecture, let's just take it as granted that central banks can do exactly that, that central banks have within it the means or mechanisms to influence rates of interest generally in the economy. Why might they do that? It's because there are components of planned aggregate expenditure that are almost certainly quite sensitive to rates of interest. Think of households, for example, household consumption. In our consumption function, we very much focused on disposable income as being a very significant determinant of household spending decisions. But interest rates could be important as well. Think about your own behaviour and your own willingness to use a credit card, for example, to finance expenditure. Well, the interest that is levied on that credit card might have a role to play in your willingness to use that card for the purposes of expenditure. But it seems for many economies the most interest-sensitive component of planned aggregate expenditure is investment, planned investment, and that's what we are going to focus on, the link between interest rates and investment. We've spoken a little bit about this before, so let me just formalise why interest rates might be so important. It gets back to the nature of investment and how the benefits of investment are only received after some time has elapsed. So think of time being measured as we head from the left-hand side of the screen to the right-hand side of the screen. Think of an investment decision that takes place today, purchasing and installing a piece of capital equipment. It's unlikely that that equipment is going to produce output today. Maybe it's only 1 month later that the capital equipment finally produces some output. And maybe it's 3 months later that that output is eventually sold. So the benefit from that investment is, at least in this framework, 3 months into the future. This creates for the firm a cash flow problem. What do I mean by that? Well, cash has to be paid up front for the purchase of the equipment. But cash is only going to be earned at some time in the future. So it's not too surprising when you think about it in these terms that a great deal of investment expenditure is financed through the borrowing of funds, which means the cost of that borrowing, the interest rate, is going to be a significant factor in influencing firms' decisions about whether or not the purchase of a piece of capital equipment, the act of investment in other words, whether that is a profitable course of action. What that means is we expect that planned injections in the economy, in particular the planned investment component of that, is most likely to be very sensitive to the rate of interest. You might, for example, have an interest rate of 5%. At an interest rate of 5%, planned injections through planned investment are as shown on this slide. If monetary policy actions are taken which reduce the interest rate from 5% to 2%, then that might encourage firms to increase their planned investment. It's cheaper to get those borrowed funds that are needed to finance the investment. We might therefore see a systematic increase in planned investment and hence in planned injections. So that's the sense in which monetary policy has a role to play in the basic Keynesian framework. It can impact on interest-sensitive components of planned aggregate expenditure, in particular on planned investment. A quick note on interest rates. They're a very complex part of the financial system, and I just want to make sure that we're on the same page and we understand what we're talking about. Let's take a very trivial example with two individuals, Jill lending $100 to Jack, and Jack promising to repay that loan after 1 year with an additional $5. There will be what's called a nominal interest rate associated with this particular loan, and I'm going to use some notation here. When I speak of the nominal interest rate, I'm going to use capital R to indicate that interest rate. Nominal interest rate is sometimes known as the market interest rate. It's the interest rate that's quoted to you when you go into a bank and apply for a loan, or it's the interest rate associated with this Jack and Jill loan that we're talking about here. In this case, the interest rate relates to the $5 payment when the loan is repaid. What is that relative to the size of the loan? $100. The The nominal interest rate in this case would be 5%. Often we write that as just 0.05. What the nominal interest rate is the interest rate that is associated with the loan, ignoring any possible changes that might be expected to occur in the purchasing power of money. What do I mean by that? I want to contrast that with a concept known as the real interest rate. Now, the real interest rate is usually not reported in the financial press. It's not what's going to be quoted to you when you go into a bank and ask for a loan. It's probably not what Jill and Jack have been discussing when they negotiated the terms of this particular loan. But in macroeconomics, it's the real interest rate rather than the nominal interest rate that actually matters for decision making. The real interest rate takes into account any expected changes in the purchasing power of money that might occur over the life of the loan. It's taking into account, if you like, the rate of price inflation that is anticipated over the life of the loan. And that's going to make a big difference. And I'm going to use lowercase r to represent the real interest rate. Let me repeat, it's the real interest rate that matters for decisions about borrowing and lending. Let me just explore that for you. Suppose the expected inflation rate over the coming year is 5%. It doesn't matter how that expectation is formed. For whatever reason, Jack and Jill anticipate that over the coming year, the rate of inflation is going to be 5%. So the real purchasing power of any given amount of money is going to be eroded by 5% over the course of the year, simply because the general level of prices in the economy is going to increase by 5% over the course of the year. What does that do to this calculation? Well, the nominal interest rate is unchanged. Remember, the nominal interest rate is simply a comparison of that end-of-year payment with the size of the loan. The nominal interest rate is still 5%. What about the real interest rate? What has Jill, for example, really gotten as a result of this transaction? Well, Jill started out with $100. She ends up at the end of the year being repaid $105. Over the course of that year, if this expectation comes to pass, the general level of prices in the economy has increased by $5. So the real purchasing power of any given amount of money has been diminished by 5%. In real terms, therefore, Jill is no better off. She had $100 of real purchasing power at the beginning of the year. She's ended the year with $105, but the real purchasing power of that $105 is no different to the real purchasing power of the $100 at the start of the year. In real terms, Jill has gained nothing. The real interest rate on this transaction is 0. So should Jill lend to Jack? Well, maybe not, because there's nothing in a real sense that Jill can gain from this loan. And that's the sense in which it's the real interest rate that actually influences decisions about borrowing and lending, not the more commonly quoted nominal interest rate. And in macroeconomics, therefore, we focus on the real interest rate as being the determinant of borrowing and lending decisions. If we're thinking about planned investment, it's the real interest rate that influences planned investment. So just a quick note on this. We're going to come back and use this finding in later lectures, so it's probably not a bad point to just clarify things. There is a formula that links all of these three terms, the real interest rate, the nominal interest rate. Now, it's a convention in macroeconomics to use the Greek letter pi to represent the inflation rate, and pi with an E there represents the expected inflation rate. So any introductory book on finance, for example, will have this formula in there. It just shows the formal link that exists between the nominal interest rate, capital R, the real interest rate, lowercase r, and the expected rate of inflation, pi e. A little bit cumbersome to work with that formula, so you can play around with it a little bit. I won't do this in any great detail because it's not all that important for our purposes, but if we multiply both sides by the denominator, 1 plus pi e, and that must equal 1 plus r. If we expand the left-hand side out, we'll end up with 1 plus pi e plus r times pi e equals 1 plus r. Subtract 1 from both sides, and this expression here is usually very small. You're usually multiplying two very small numbers in that case, so let's, just for convenience sake, call that equal to 0. What you're left with, if you rearrange it, is that expression there, and that's the one we'll work with, that the economy's real interest rate is equivalent to the nominal interest rate minus the expected rate of inflation. That's a very famous equation in economics, and you'll often come across this term. It's called the Fisher equation, after a very famous American economist, Irving Fisher, who first thought seriously about these issues and realised this important distinction between the real and the nominal interest rate. For our purposes, though, what I want to highlight is that it's the real interest rate that influences planned investment decisions. So when I talk about the link between interest rates and planned investment, it's actually a link between the real interest rate and planned investment. I'm going to come back and explore these issues about interest rates and the economy in a subsequent lecture. But let's just continue on how monetary policy fits into the basic Keynesian model. So we've seen how fiscal policy can be used to try to counteract a contractionary output gap. We've talked about some of the problems with that. Let's suppose those problems are of sufficient concern that fiscal policy is ruled out as an option and instead monetary policy is turned to, or, as we've seen in the global financial crisis, the problem is so large that it's thought that neither fiscal nor monetary policy alone can address the problem, but you need both of them. But let's focus now on monetary policy. In this basic Keynesian framework, it actually doesn't look all that different from fiscal policy. What we're trying to do is to boost planned aggregate expenditure in the economy, to eliminate the contractionary output gap. But with monetary policy, what we're going to do is focus on providing incentives for firms to boost their planned investment. And we can do that through the mechanism of providing firms with lower real interest rates through monetary policy. So if that's the level of planned injections associated with a real interest rate of 5%, then the role for monetary policy is perhaps to cut the real interest rate to 2%, in doing so providing encouragement for firms to boost their planned investment, shifting the planned investment line upwards and restoring equilibrium at potential GDP. So that's the monetary policy approach to trying to address a contractionary output gap.